So I'm gonna take you on a little journey to a land called frame within a frame within a frame. So this is, if you're not good at miters, you will be by the end of this, because there are 3 sets and essentially 3 frames that go together. We've got this bird's eye maple outer frame, we've got a dimpled textured interior made out of walnut, and then a bird's eye maple interior, and then your artwork, pictures, whatever, approximately 8 by 10 can go in the center. All right, so it's actually not that difficult, it's just a little bit tedious with all those different miters. But let me talk a little bit more about the materials. So to build our frame, I'm gonna use some maple and walnut. Now the walnut is for the internal area. We're gonna do a little bit of dimpling and texturing there. So I don't really need something that's sort of a remarkable figure. In fact, the plainer it is, the better. I don't wanna waste good figure just to dimple the surface and make it not visible. So that's for the internal section, but the inner and the outer frames are gonna be made from something that is a little bit more special. I've got some bird's eye maple here that's absolutely gorgeous. It's even got a little bit of curl to it, and that will serve as sort of kind of punctuates the frame a little bit on the inside and the outside, but it's a frame within a frame, so we've got some milling to do to bring these down to size. Head over to the joiner and planer.
All of the stock is flattened on one face at the jointer. With the jointed face against the fence, an adjacent edge is made flat and square. The innermost frame pieces are pretty small, but we can still square them up at the jointer. Just need to be extra careful not to accidentally push the push blocks into the cutter head. As an alternative, you could mill up a wider board and simply rip off the required strips at the table saw. Each piece is then brought down to the appropriate thickness at the planer. The outer frame is 3/4 of an inch thick, and both inner frames are a 1/2 inch thick. The pieces are then cut to final width at the table saw. 2 inch wide for the outer maple, 3 inch wide for the inner walnut, 1 inch wide for the inner maple.
So our frame pieces require a few different rabbets, the inner frame and the outer frame. So the inner frame actually gets 2 rabbets, the outer frame gets 1. You have a couple different ways you could do this. The router table with a straight bit is certainly an option. You could use a rabbeting bit. You could even go handheld with a rabbeting bit if you wanted to. Because the pieces are all nice and flat and straight at this point, one of the easiest ways to do it is at the table saw using a dado stack, and I've got one right here that we'll set up. That'll be a very quick way to get the job done. You could, if you wanted to, if you don't have a dado stack, just use a standard blade, and each rabbet can be made by making 2 cuts, one way and one the other way, and it just releases that little piece. A little bit dicey on smaller parts, but it can work. So I'm gonna get set up for the dado cuts here, and then we'll make all these rabbets.
The dado stack is set up for a 1/4 inch wide cut. Using a piece of scrap, I set the depth of the dado to a 1/4 inch. The fence is then set as needed to make the 2 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch rabbets on the smaller inner frame. One rabbet is for the artwork, and the other is so the inner frame can nest into the walnut frame. After the first round of cuts, I wised up a bit and used my feather boards to help stabilize the work pieces. The outer frame receives a 1/2 inch by 1/4 inch rabbet, so the blade is raised to a 1/2 inch. Instead of measuring the test piece with a ruler, use the walnut frame itself. When it sits flush in the rabbet, the blade is high enough. Now set the fence distance and make the cut.
So we've got a lot of different choices when it comes to cutting miters. We could certainly use the miter saw. Another great option is to use the table saw with a miter gauge. And if you have a good reliable gauge, the cool thing is you could set it for 90 degrees, and then you just know that the 45-degree setting is right where it needs to be, or whatever angle it is you want to use. But we do want to confirm the setup, okay? So first thing I'm going to do is check it to make sure it's 90 degrees, and then I have some scrap pieces, and we'll make some test cuts at 45 just to make sure that everything is what we think it is. So I've got a good, reliable 6-inch square that I'm just gonna run alongside my miter gauge fence here and bring it right into the body of the blade. You really just wanna be on the plate. You don't wanna touch the teeth. And when I do that, I really don't see any gap whatsoever, which tells me that the gauge is perfectly 90 with respect to the blade. So when I set it to 45, it should also be perfect.
When setting a miter gauge to an angle other than 90, always double check to make sure that you aren't going to accidentally cut into the fence. Thankfully, I noticed I was headed for trouble, and I was able to avoid a mishap. close call. That looks perfect. Now cut the miters on all of the frame parts. I know for a lot of folks, miters can be frustrating and intimidating, but as you can see, if you get one perfectly square corner, you're pretty much done. If the corner is out of square, make an adjustment to the miter gauge and cut again. If, in spite of this setup process, you still can't get perfect miters, then something is off with the setup or the procedure.
So to glue my frame parts together, I'm going to use this Merle adjustable clamp, and it's basically sort of a band clamp system that you can actually add more heads to it so that you can have a 4-sided thing. You could have a 5, 6, 7, however many is appropriate for your project, and you can kind of clamp in this circular fashion like that and just tighten it up. And it works great on frames like this. So when we just dry assemble, to make sure all the joints are going to go together, you just make sure you have one in each corner. You can tighten this guy up, pull the slack, tighten it up, and then start to turn the handle. And slowly but surely, as it applies pressure, you want to come back and just kind of move things around, make sure they go where they're supposed to. You apply a little more pressure, check again, and slowly but surely, you should see your joints close up. And this is a great way to get perfect even pressure across 4 miter joints. I don't mean to brag and I don't mean to boast, but I like hot butter on my breakfast toast. Now, the glue is set up that I can remove the clamp, and you can actually see some of the glue in the corners. It's probably a good idea to remove that before it actually starts to get really, really hard. So it's still semi-soft at this point. I can just kind of peel it out of there. Now that the innermost frame is established, we have our artwork space, which is really the critical dimension here. Everything else can be built upon from that point. So the walnut section is going to rest in like so. I mean, it's a little bit easier to understand if we look at it like it would face off the wall. We're going to put it in like this. So in order to cut the walnut parts, I'm going to size them based on this internal frame. It's actually pretty easy. I'm just going to bring my work pieces up here. And wherever the other miters are on the inner frame is exactly where they need to go on the outer frame, like this. So we'll just sneak up on the fit until we get it right and then apply that to the rest of the pieces.
You know you have the right measurements when the inner frame drops in cleanly. It's okay to have just a little bit of wiggle room here. Now glue the walnut frame together. If the edges don't meet up perfectly, use a mallet or a dead blow to flush them up. The outer maple frame is cut and fit in the same fashion as the walnut frame.
So while I cut the miters pretty nicely, everything seems to be fitting on the frame. I did confront a little bit of a problem. It appears on this one piece that probably on my way back, pulling it back on the miter gauge, I just kind of gouged the end grain a little bit, and what that's doing is causing there to be a gap, even though the fit is pretty good. So I think what I'm gonna do is take just, maybe a 30-second off just to clean this up.
I'll make this cut on both of my longer frame pieces to keep things even. Then I could just glue it together.
So it looks like the miters cleaned up real nice, and I actually did apparently have enough slop in there to not have to cut this inner walnut frame. So with the clamp in there, you can see it's nice and tight. So at this point, I want to prepare for the texturing of this interior surface. Now, where the 2 frames lay on top of the walnut, I don't really want the texturing to go under those rabbets. It just wouldn't look right. So I want them to join up with nice flat material. So what I'm going to do this is actually put the frames in place. I'm just going to trace around with a pencil, and that's my line to not go over when it comes to this texturing dimpling process. And once we have that in place, it's time to dimple.
This dimpling process is something that I've done a few times in the past, and it's a pretty fun way to add interesting texture to an otherwise plain surface. I recommend using an oval-shaped mill in a die grinder to make tiny little divots across the surface in a seemingly random pattern. Don't try to make a random pattern. Instead, thoroughly cover the area systematically 1 row at a time, and then make a few passes crisscross and perpendicular to the previous pattern. It's a little awkward at first, but once you find your groove, your hands will get used to the motion, and soon you'll be tapping away. In the end, it looks random enough. When you think you're done, do the last pass looking for any areas that you may have missed. The inner and outer frames receive a nice chamfer. In the corners, you'll need to use a nice sharp chisel to finish the profile. After gluing and clamping the maple frame, it turns out that I do need to trim the walnut frame just a little bit. A few passes with the jack plane should do the trick. For the glue up, first glue the walnut frame to the outer maple frame. A few clamps will provide the needed pressure to keep the walnut securely in the rabbet. Once dry, put a bead of glue on the small maple frame and drop that inside the walnut. A few spring clamps will hold it in place. Try to be careful about glue squeeze out here, since cleaning up glue on a textured surface can be a real pain. To finish the frame, I'll be using a wiping varnish. This happens to be General Finish's Armor Seal Satin, but any wiping varnish will work. The good thing about a picture frame is that it won't be handled very much, so you don't need a crazy durable finish. All you need is something that looks good. The next day, I'll give the surface a light sanding with 400 grit wet dry paper, then vacuum off the dust, and then apply another coat. A total of 3 coats should do the trick.
So here's our finished frame. Now, what I really like about this is it shows how a simple mitered frame can be just kind of reimagined into something completely different. And all we really have here are 3 mitered frames put together. Right, so when you're doing a mitered frame, you have a lot of opportunity, and I think material choice is where you could really just let the wood speak for itself. You don't have to do much to let beautiful wood be beautiful, right? So even in this center section, you can see we've got a very simple, unadorned piece of walnut, right? There's nothing special about it until we add the texture. And now suddenly, this becomes something that's visually going to pop when people look at it. And while we could have just used regular old maple for the outside frame, again, there was an opportunity to let the wood do some of the talking for us. So this bird's eye maple looks absolutely stunning. Right, so you can get really creative, think about the materials you use, and use them in a way that just makes this thing visually interesting. The other thing I'll mention is, of course, we have glass installed, backer boards installed, and a method for hanging this. We're going to cover that at the very end when all of our frames are done, and I'll show you various techniques for handling all of that stuff. All right, thanks for watching.